welcome to our 11th NEMIS Academy webinar. I'm extremely happy to see the same and new faces coming over to watch to our industry experts and to get new knowledge. My name is Alina Bonadonna and I will be today's moderator of our beautiful session. Please welcome our speaker, Nic Sharman, this beautiful, brilliant lady with 29 years of experience in food safety industry will share the best of her knowledge today. How are you, Nic?
I'm doing really well, thank you, Alina. Yeah.
Great, happy to see you here.
Yeah.
And where are you based now?
I'm in the UK in South Oxfordshire in Didcot. So quite central, easy to get around everywhere, really.
Perfect. Okay, guys, let's do also technical checkup. If you hear me well, see me well, and also drop your location in the chat room. We are really curious from where you are. Okay. Paris. Hi, Christine from Paris. Great. More continents? Yeah, it's coming, of course. Of course. Great. That's amazing. I love our academy for such international community. And today, definitely, you will get the best knowledge ever from our expert in food safety industry. So I will not take much time from our speaker because you know that we have quite limited time for presentation and after for a question answer session. I would just ask you guys to be extremely active throughout the webinar because after we will have only 20 minutes to answer all your questions. So drop in the chat room all the sharpest question you will have during the presentation. And Nic, I'm sure she can't wait to answer all these questions. So are you ready, Nic?
Yes, I'm ready.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's start. Time is yours.
Thank you. I will just pop the presentation on.
Great.
Good to go. Well, thank you very much for a wonderful introduction and so lovely to have so many people attend today. So I'm going to take you through HACCP and auditing of HACCP. So as Alina has already mentioned, I have nearly 30 years experience in the food industry and more recently has been doing quite a lot with consultancy. I deliver training and I also do lots of auditing of manufacturing sites. My background has been, I started in the factories, on the factory lines, worked my way up and got to technical manager. I've also done M&S retail and I had a stint owning a business and doing hospitality for 10 years too. So quite a broad range of experience over the years, but always kind of hung back to HACCP. I know some people try and run away from it, but I quite enjoy that. At which point I did do my master's in food safety management and that gave me a level 7 in HACCP. So I've left my contact details on the presentation slide, so if anyone wants to get in touch, please feel free to do so. So things we're going to go through today is HACCP, how it all started with NASA, what's required by Codex. We're going to talk about the prerequisite program management systems and linking to what's required with BRCGS standards. We're going to understand risks and hazards and how that all comes together in the hazard analysis. We'll look at validation, verification and clarification of that terminology. And throughout the presentation, I'll be explaining how we would audit things around the HACCP program and look at the benefits of how you could use a process flow diagram, CCP summary sheets when auditing a factory, and some of the key documentation to see and support the HACCP program. So let's get started. Now, every business wants to produce safe and legal food, and we need to do that by having a robust food safety management system in place. And as part of that food safety management system, you're going to need good manufacturing practices, good hygiene practices, but also within that, a HACCP study which captures all of the food safety requirements that you need to implement. And we're going to dive into some of that now. So HACCP, it was originally developed as a microbiological safety system for the US manned space program. And at that time, they were trying to do lots of their management of food safety was generally through testing. But obviously, if they test everything, they've got nothing to use or sell. So they had to put a preventative system in place that could give a high level of food safety assurance. And that's how the HACCP system was born. So it was created by the Pillsbury Company in the US, and they were working alongside NASA and the US Army laboratories. So if we think that's been going for quite a few decades now, but we still find some issues along the way with HACCP because we're still finding those challenges. We're still getting recalls, we're still seeing incidents occur. So it's understanding what is it that's still going wrong. But HACCP should be looking for the hazards and what could go wrong, putting those controls and management systems in place to ensure that the product is safe and can't cause harm to the consumer. I couldn't think of anything worse than an astronaut getting food poisoning at zero gravity. That is not something we all want to experience. So I can understand why they wanted to put something in place. So what do we follow now as an industry? Well, we've got Codex Alimentarius, which is an international food standard. And you'll see that it's been revised in 2022. Whose previous version was in 2020, so it was quite a short iteration between the two versions. And what this version gives you is an annex at the back, Annex 4, and it then gives you the decision tree, which was taken out in 2020, and everyone goes, refer to the Codex decision tree. Well, there isn't one anymore. So they have put one back in now, so you can go and refer to that, which we'll come to later in this presentation. But if we think about what Codex ultimately want us to do, we always want to have that food safety and suitability of products need to be controlled using a science-based preventative approach. And that's what we call HACCP. So it's applying those prerequisite programs and good hygiene practices. We know that they're the building blocks and the foundation for a really good, robust HACCP system. And it's important to have really good awareness of hazards. Now, this is where I find companies tend to fall down at the first hurdle because they don't understand the inherent risks with their raw materials. So you have to go and get literature, you have to go and get further information and look at data to understand what the inherent risks are. And then also consider in the raw material, let's say the raw material is a dry powder, there might be a risk of salmonella. If it stays dry throughout the process, that salmonella is not going to grow. But if it moves into production or preparation and becomes a wet paste, then that's a whole different risk that we need to manage. So we need to consider how our raw materials arrive, what are the inherent risks, and how that can affect throughout production, preparation, and then also, is there a risk from the environment itself that could contaminate the product? So all of these things we need to establish are what are the hazards. And then we look at the application of good hygiene practices. And we know that alone, they're not going to be sufficient. We need to use a combination of good hygiene practices, good manufacturing practices, as well as making sure those CCPs are under control to make the food safe. And these control measures, they need to be scientifically validated. And that's something else that sometimes is lacking in businesses. They need to have a proper validation to know that the control will work. And then reviews. This is also an area that companies do because it is a requirement of a GFSI accreditation schemes. But some companies do it quite sparsely and others go into lots of detail. So I think it's an area that we can all improve on across the board or share those learnings. And then when we put all this system together, a lovely team of people have been really careful and diligent and put all this information together. We then need to make sure that the whole supply chain, the factory, the whole system understands what processes you've organised and what needs to put in place. So that communication plan needs to be just as important as developing the whole system. So the first 5 preliminary steps to HACCP is what's detailed in Codex. So the first one is the really important part of assembling that team. making sure that you've got lots of different people on that team. And we also want to identify the scope of the study. We describe the product and we identify its intended use and users. We construct a process flow diagram, and we also need to confirm on site, that means walking the flow, to make sure that that flow diagram is accurate. So when we come to auditing these preliminary steps, the key things that we look for is making sure that that team is multidisciplinary. It includes all departments, and it doesn't mean that it's only just the managers. It's really important that other people, such as supervisors and operators, they might not be on the HACCP team for all of the time, but what we would like to see is that you bring those people in when we're talking about their line, because they will probably understand at that specific process step what the hazards are. They will know that certain things always break. They will know that that line keeps, that belt sometimes loses tracking, and then we can get some shaving of plastic going on down there. So it's really important to involve all departments across and throughout the business. And then looking at the scope, this should be quite a detailed section of the HACCP study. We want to understand what the product is that you're making and what process it's going to go through. And then identify the responsibility of that business from start to end. Now, what I mean by that is sometimes a business can have the responsibility, they all have the responsibility from when it arrives at the back door, generally. And then the end could be different. It could be you still own that during transit until it gets to the customer. It could be that you end at dispatch door. When it gets on that vehicle, it's no longer your responsibility. So it's understanding where the process starts and finishes. And that might vary between different contracts. So your HACCP flow needs to match with what your start and end process is at worst case. We also like to see the prerequisites in the scope. So we can see the prerequisite programme, which we'll come on to in more detail in a minute, and document the risk assessment to be used in the hazard analysis. So this risk assessment we talk about, we're looking to have, I quite like the 3x3 because it takes out less ambiguity when we use a 5x5 grid. So you've got a low, medium and high score for severity and likelihood. And if you go to 5, then it expands those ranges from low to a little bit not as low to medium and then high and very high. And then it just becomes quite complicated. It depends on what the business prefers to use, and you go with whatever suits you. There's no right or wrong, so long as we have some form of a risk assessment in place. So let's look at severity first. If we think about a high rating, that's where we're saying the severity of that hazard is likely to cause illness. It could be a potential to cause serious harm, or it could even cause death. It's a major financial damage to the brand or the business if that hazard occurred. A medium would be the hazard as a potential to cause the short-term illness or harm, which would require medical attention. It could result in a product recall or withdrawal. And a low severity rating would be the hazard is unlikely to cause illness or harm to the consumer, and it could cause upset or repulsion. But then when we look at likelihood, this is where you need to look at what has happened in your business over the last 12, 24 months. So how likely is it to occur, that specific hazard, in that process step? So if it's very likely to occur, you would score it 3 and it's high. And actually the whole batch of that production could be affected. If the likelihood is possible to occur, then a proportion of the batch would be affected and we would grade it as medium. And then low is unlikely to occur and the problem would be isolated to a small quantity. So that's a low risk. So you can see how the severity and the likelihood works between the two. And then what happens next is we work out by using the grid that you can see at the bottom, the risks matrix. So you would times the severity by the likelihood, and then you get a score. So if we've got a medium likelihood and a high severity, you can see you would score it as a 6. So looking at the impact rating, something that's high is a problem that would result in a recall, media attention, or some other publicly taken action. A medium is 3 to 4, where the problem would result in external reactions such as enforcement or customer action. And a low is the problem would cause a complaint, but it could be resolved internally. It doesn't require external influence to sort out that problem. But what I would be looking for at this point when you audit is understanding what the business has said, what score, what significant hazard level is going to then determine I now need to take it through the decision tree. So somewhere in this section, you would see something along this terminology of a score of 3 or greater will go through the decision tree to determine if the hazard is critical to food safety and control can be applied. The hazard can then be categorised as a CCP or a PRP. So it's really important that you have that in the back of your mind. You've already read that in the beginning. Then when you look at the hazard analysis, you want to see that they followed through with what they initially said in the scope of the HACCP study. So prerequisite programmes are also mentioned in the scope. Now, this is a screenshot from the BRCGS standard. And as you can see, they mention a few different prerequisites that they would like you to have in place, but they also say that it's not an exhaustive list. So things like cleaning and disinfection, pest management, preventative maintenance, personal hygiene, staff training, supplier approval and purchasing, transportation arrangements, preventing of cross-contamination and allergen management are a must. And then there might be other things that you wish to put in place when it comes to prerequisite programs. Now, remembering that prerequisite programs are something that happens across the whole business. So it's not specific to a process step, because that's what the hazard analysis will sort out. So these are the things that are generic across the company, but we still need controls in place. And just out of interest, if you look at most recalls, they're not down to CCPs, they're down to prerequisites. So if you just really focus on making sure the prerequisites are just as important as the CCPs, then hopefully we might see a change in recall that's happening across the world. Now, where these said that it's not an exhaustive list, Codex has also added a few extras in their standard too. So these are things that they've mentioned, things like location, structure and flow. So that's actually about the building. Is it painted? Is it flaky paint? And making sure it's not all wood and all those usual typical things that we would expect to find in the business. What facilities are in place? What storage you've got? How the lighting is? Air quality and ventilation, drainage, water, waste management and environmental control. So when you combine these two processes together, these two lists together, you'll see that actually it's quite a substantial programme that you've got as things that are happening around the business that we always need control of, but they're not directly linked to the process. Now, these steps from 1 to 8 are something that I would suggest you put as the headings of the table that you would put in your prerequisite programme. So you would identify what the prerequisite is, then you would say what hazards are associated with that source, and the hazards would be no different than the hazard analysis. You would look at physical, chemical, microbiological, and allergens. We would look at what the control measures are, what those limits are for the controls, the monitoring of the procedures, how frequent we're going to do them, and then look at the responsibilities and who are our food safety guardians, which I'll come on to in a second. And then also, things do go wrong. Life happens, things do happen, things break, lines stop working. We need to know what happens in that corrective action. So all of this needs to be put in place in the scope in the prerequisite programs. Now, I mentioned guardians, and this is a term that I heard in the last few months by a lovely lady called Louise Manning. And her and Alexandra have written a paper, and I've put a reference to this document at the end of the presentation for you to read at your leisure. But something around guardianship really resonated with me. And I think when we think about guardianship, it's the process of defending and securing something is the definition. So when we relate that to our world, that's around making sure the safety and the integrity of the food product, someone's looking after it to make sure that it is safe. And I think guardians extends beyond compliance, because it's somebody it's that behavioural piece. It's making sure that they are going to manage that challenge, that task that you've asked them to deliver. So I think as a business, you should always think about who are your capable guardians. Have a look at who the individuals are, who's got the capability to ensure that hygienic conditions are maintained and food safety incidents are minimised. But think about how you're going to empower them, how you're going to make them want to be that guardian of that process. And that's where the culture part fits in. So it's really important that we get the right behaviours and the right attitudes to managing our prerequisite programmes and CCPs throughout the business. So let's go back to auditing these preliminary steps. We've looked at steps 1 to 3 already, and now we've constructed our process flow diagram. Now, as an auditor, I often find issues with process flow diagrams. They don't always include all the steps. It can often be quite generic. So generic, I mean, it's just top level. It just tells me that raw materials come in, they go to storage, they get decanted, and maybe not even decanted sometimes. It's prepared, processed, and then dispatched. And it can be really, really simple. But actually HACCP needs to be really detailed. So we're making sure that all those processes have been identified. We don't forget about packaging. People forget about packaging, and sometimes they forget about how it's actually going to get to the line, how you're going to debox that and bring it into the area without causing a foreign body risk. And then think about all the things that are in contact with the product. So we need to think about the air, the water or steam. They all need to be on your process flow, because we need to see that filters have been put in place to make sure that those are coming in as clean as possible. And then if you're working in a factory that's got high care or high risk, we want to know on the process flow where things move from low to high, and then when it leaves from high and goes back into low. So it's good to have a line, or some people put the high area, high care or high risk area into like a coloured box, so you can see that that is where the higher risk and the open product happens, where we have to make sure there's no cross-contamination. So it depends how you do it. Just make sure it's very visible of how you move between the different areas. And a process flow cannot be assessed in a meeting room. I always find it quite destroying when I watch an auditor and I'm there to help my client and they don't take the process flow with them, but they come back to the boardroom and then try and critique it. You have to have it on factory tour to follow all the steps. Okay, so steps 6 to 12 are the 7 HACCP principles, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. But the first one is to do the understand where the hazards are. So we're doing our hazard analysis. We determine the critical control points. We validate them. We monitor them. Put the corrective actions in place. And then we validate the whole HACCP plan and the verification procedures and establish documentation and record keeping. These are all that are listed out in the Codex Alimentarius standard. So when it comes to doing our hazard analysis, the first thing that you must do, and it's an absolute must, is make sure when we're doing this likelihood and severity to determine the significant hazard, this is all done in the absence of control. And that is very explicit in Codex and throughout all of the standards in the industry. So make sure you do it in the absence of control, because then what we're going to do is put the controls in place to manage that hazard and what that risk is. So make sure the hazards are specific to the process step, and make sure that where we've said it's a significant hazard, it's then taken through the decision tree. So I've pulled out an example of one process step, and often metal detection does come out as a CCP. if it's at the end of the process. So on this occasion, we've said it's metal detection, the hazard is a physical hazard, and the specific hazard at that step is metal. We've said the likelihood is a 2, and that's because there's been metal findings in the last 12 months, which we've identified in the justification. So therefore, the severity could be a 3 because we might end up in a product recall situation. So when we times the 2 together, we get 6, which then takes us into our high risk area, high risk rating, and it needs to go through the decision tree. This is a reminder of that grid. So when we said it came to 6, that's why we've then said it now needs to go through the decision tree because it's been graded as a 6, and there's a potential for a recall. So if we look at the decision tree, this is what Codex have now provided us, which is actually a really nice, simple decision tree to utilise. So the question 1, we've answered no, because it says, can the significant hazard be controlled to an acceptable level at this step by the prerequisite programme? Well, no, it's not in the prerequisite programme. So question 2, do specific control measures for the identified significant hazard exist at this step? Yes, we've got all the controls, and we do all the testing. So will a subsequent step, this is the change in the language on the decision trees from previous ones. So will the subsequent step prevent or eliminate the identified significant hazard or reduce it to an acceptable level? In this instance, it's a no, because we're expecting the metal detector to do that task. So question 4, can this step specifically prevent or eliminate the identified significant hazard or reduce it to an acceptable level? Yes, it can. That's exactly what it's determined to do. So it does become a CCP. So you'll see in the top right-hand corner, that's the table again with all the answers to those questions. And we've said that's now CCP1. So you'll find this in Annex 4 in the Codex document. So when we come to, then we've now said it's CCP1. So then you need to create a CCP1 summary sheet. Now this format is also in the Codex Annex 4 and Table 2. So these are the headings that they suggest you use, and I think they're really robust structure actually. So we would take the process step of metal detection. We're repeating what we said before with the hazard being metal. The critical limit is there's going to be a metal present. We don't want metal present. Now the monitoring, you would check the metal detectors working. How are you going to do that? You're going to use different metal detector test pieces. You could expand on this. I haven't done that for you today, but you could give more detail of how you're going to do it. You're going to explain when you're going to do it and who's going to do that. Then you're going to say what you do when things go wrong. So what are your corrective actions? And then what verification activities would you put in place to make sure that that process is working properly? And then finally, where you're going to record it. It might not be paperwork anymore. People are using digital systems. So it might be referencing somewhere on that digital program that you need to document the information. But that's something else. So when you audit a factory, you would take this CCP summary sheet and the process flow into the factory with you. So you want to follow the process, and then when you get to the CCP, check that this summary sheet matches what you're seeing in the factory. Now we talk about validation and verification, and I know it's been talked about a lot, but it's really still not understood about this terminology, and people do use it incorrectly. So let's just recap on what the standards say. So validation is obtaining evidence through the provision of objective evidence that a control or measure, if properly implemented, is capable of delivering a specified outcome. So basically, can it work to make safe food? The process that you've put in place, will it do the job? And then verification is the application of methods, procedures, tests, or other evaluations in addition to monitoring to determine whether a control or measure is or has been operating as intended. So the verification is all the activities that you do throughout the process to see that it does work on a repeated basis. Other key documents that you could find during auditing across the standard, across the HACCP system, things like your internal audits, that's going to help show how your food safety management system is put in place. And internal audits, there's so much research being done in recent months at Cardiff Met, where they found actually that the more that they do on internal audits as a business, the better their third-party audit scores are. Now, that correlation shouldn't really be too much of a surprise, but we've now got the research to prove that that's the case. Other things that we would look for, so as we're auditing, we're going around and you're getting the people to show you to do things, you take down the names, and then when you come back to the boardroom, you would then find out what their training records are and make sure they're always up to date. So be one step ahead of the auditor, whoever's name they're writing down. You need to be preempting that with the team to make sure that they're getting all the information together. It's quite impressive when you walk back to the boardroom and the information's ready to see. So that's a good thing to do. Foreign body controls, we've talked a little bit about that already. Micro results, these are really good indicator for how the business is operating and how that food safety management system is working in practice. So I would always look at water and environmental swabs and product swabs and look at all of them in totality to see, are there any trends? Is there anything that's indicating where we've got something that's going out of line? Also, is the business culture there to make sure that we are cleaning well and that we aren't getting repeated fails? Then you can dig into what's going on with cleaning. Temperature controls are other documents you can see, and paperwork compliance. I always like to look at what they do for startup checks for paperwork compliance. It's a good thing to see when you've identified something in the factory that's not right. What did they find on their startup checks? What has their shift person said when they've walked that line and said, yes, I'm good to go? Why do they write down it's all fine when it's not? So you have to try and understand what behaviour is driving them to do that. Validation studies, they need to be very detailed, especially around the CCPs. We'd expect every CCP to have a validation study. And you'd also want to know that the whole total HACCP plan can do what it's supposed to do. We look at cleaning standards as part of the food safety system and pest control. Non-conformance logs is another one that I look for to see around for culture. Is the business providing you with the resources, whether it's financial or people, to make sure all these non-conformances are closed out? So that's another area that you would be wanting to check on. Complaints is a good indicator to show what's getting through the system for a customer to be saying, I'm not happy. So that's a good indicator to show, is the HACCP system working? And then also we want to be looking at preventative. So what else can we do when it comes to maintenance and making sure our equipment is calibrated to achieve what is required for our HACCP plan? So that gives you a bit of a summary of other documentation that you would look for in audits to check that your HACCP system is functioning as you would expect it to. So I'm going to finish there, but if you have any questions, I will be delighted to answer them. And again, here's my details if you wish to get in touch. But thank you very much for listening. Back to Alina.
Thank you everyone so much for listening to this amazing presentation. And by the way, in our small banner, you can find the link to connect with Nic in LinkedIn straight away if you want so. I'm sure you were curious to know more, but right now is the exact time when you can answer questions. You can ask your questions, sorry. And actually the first question is already in the chat from Hafiz. How can we validate decision tree?
How can you validate the decision tree?
Yes.
I don't know if you would validate the decision tree because you're having to, is it validating the CCP? I can understand, but I don't think you would validate the decision tree itself because that is industry standard practice. So you're just asking the questions of, is there another step to control that process? If there's not, then you would go back and that might become your critical control point. When you go through that process, it might not always come out as a CCP, it might be a prerequisite. You might choose to say, actually, I have operational prerequisites. Businesses can use this as a template and adapt to make the language work for whatever you decide. I just want you to control the points.
Okay, thank you very much. And there are more and more questions are coming, which is extremely cool. So the next question comes from Martin. Are there different decision trees that could be used?
There are some different decision trees. This is relatively new, and I know it's only 22 that it was brought out, but I still think a lot of people don't realise Codex updated even in 2020. So you can use that. There's one with Camden BRI, they have one. If you log on to, I only know the British ones, I'm afraid. The other one is Technique, Cassie Marsh's system. If you log on to her platform, then you can find a really good decision tree on there as well, which is very similar approach to the Codex one. I think the answer, Martin, really is just so long as you've gone through that methodical process of understanding, is it a critical control point, you'll not be scored either way, as long as you reference where you got your information from. But businesses can create their own.
Definitely. Definitely, it's also personalized, probably. Next question is coming from Israel. Is HACCP done on the entire operation process or on each product of the company?
Now that's a really good question because it depends. The HACCP plan, if you've got lots of different processes happening, sometimes people do it by line, sometimes people do it by the whole business. And that just depends on the complexity of your processes. So if you've got multiple processes that are very different, let's say we're in a, I don't know what product you make, but let's say we've got a factory that I've been in recently. They had one area, they were making chocolate, liquid chocolate. Then they had another area that was making biscuits, and they were using that chocolate to put on the biscuits. And they had another area that was doing jellies. All of those different products, even though they're all under one roof, couldn't all fit under one process. You would have to have separate process flows. So I think it depends on the complexity of your business as to what you need to do.
Definitely. The next question comes from Manoy. Could you please share the methodology of validation of metal detection?
The methodology, well, first of all, you would use a company, either the manufacturer of your metal detector, to do this work, to verify. What we need to do is work out what test pieces you need to use for your product. That is the first step. So you work on how, I often say to people, have a grid that's got 30 boxes in there. And in those boxes, I'm going to test my product at, let's say, 2 millimeters, and I'm going to see if all of those reject. Okay, so I've got 30 rejections. I'm then going to reduce that down to 1.5 millimeters, and I'm going to see if everything rejects. All 30 again reject at 1.5. If they do, I go again to 1. And I keep going down until I get to the point where sometimes it doesn't reject and it passes through. And I know at that point I can't go to that detection piece because it's not 100%. It's not always going to reject my pieces. So that's how I work out the test pieces. And then you would also validate it on your speed. So your engineers need to get involved to make sure it's rejecting at the right place. So it's test pieces and speed of the equipment going through. Also, you have to bear in mind of the consistency of the product. If it's salty, it can affect it. If it's frozen, it can affect it. If there's moisture or vibration in the area. So try not to do your validation study with the equipment, not in the location that it's going to always be used, because that will affect the functionality of the equipment.
Thank you very much, Nic, for answer. Next question comes from Hafiz. I always feel difficulties to remember difference between PRP and OPRP. Is there any learning trick?
Well, prerequisite programs are across the piece, as we know. But I find operational prerequisites are in place where, let's say we've done a clean and we have to make sure that that allergen that was previously on that line has now been removed. Sometimes businesses refer to that as an operational prerequisite. I cannot start production until I know for sure that the allergen has been removed. So it prevents you operating. And that's how I remember it. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's generally how I work with it. Is it going to stop me operating my production line?
Thank you. Next question comes from Carmen. What is your opinion about to have a CCP for washing vegetables? Probably it was HACCP for washing vegetables. If you have already contemplate the risk in the prerequisites approved and accredited suppliers cleaning the vegetables with pyracetic acid. Probably my pronunciation is not the best for this question. So
I think what Carmen's saying is that she's got vegetables that she's washing that somebody else has already washed for her. So she wants to know if that should be a CCP or not.
Yeah, probably.
I couldn't tell you, sat here. I don't know. You have to be in the factory environment. You have to understand what hazard is it that could still be present, and is there a further step that's going to get rid of it? And if there's no subsequent step that's going to remove that hazard, then you need to make sure that that is a critical control point. I do often see decontamination as a critical point because there is no other time when that's going to be decontaminated, regardless of how it arrives to you. So I can only go off what I've seen from experience, but it also does depend on if it's already been pre-washed, what hazard are you trying to remove, and does that then become a prerequisite if there isn't one to remove?
Yeah, and additionally, Carmen wrote listeria. Probably it was related to this.
Yeah. Then you would probably still require extra controls. It might be an operational prerequisite. It's hard to tell without walking the flow and understanding more about the process.
Yeah, exactly. The risk is to receive vegetables contaminated with listeria, definitely.
Yeah. Then you need the decent controls around your chlorination or whichever process you've gone through to decontaminate the vegetables.
Okay, thank you very much, Nic. I was actually curious throughout the whole presentation how to implement this all theoretical knowledge to practice. You know, are there any your personal methodologies or personal steps how to do it?
What, to move it from a document into real life, to embed it in life? It's also education. Your food safety training really has to be robust to be able to get people to do what you want them to do. The managers, first of all, need to walk the talk, is what I use as a phrase. You need to see that they are doing what you want them to do, and then everybody else will follow as a leader, because people will follow what other people do. So it's making sure we've got the good communication and a training program in place to embed the processes that you're wanting them to do to make safe food, and understanding why. It's okay giving people education if they're just telling them how to do something. But some people forget to tell them why they're doing it. And then they go, oh, I see. Oh, in that case, I'll do it. Rather than just being shown how to do something.
And just in terms of curiosity, is it possible to copy-paste the HACCP plan from one company to another?
Not really. Only when it comes to the headings of the tables. Yeah, prerequisites, most prerequisites across companies are quite similar. They are quite similar. You would have to make sure that they are the same, but the hazard analysis, absolutely not, no. It is unique to each business.
Thank you very much, Nic. So as far as I see, no questions so far. Maybe last minute question will be here in a few seconds. In the meantime, I just want to invite you guys for the next webinar, which will be already 14th of August with a Sterling crew, and we will talk about food authenticity and mitigating emergency risk and threats. So it's definitely something you cannot miss. And for sure, after this session today, you will get the presentation on your email as well as recorded video, and additionally recorded video will be posted to our LinkedIn page. So looks like people went to brainstorm on the heard information. I went to digest everything we discussed today. So thank you very much, Nic, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the invite. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone who registered. I really appreciate that you choose us for knowledge sharing and knowledge getting as the key platform we are really developing. We are searching for the best speakers for you, for the best industry experts. And see you next time. Just follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe for further webinars. Have a nice day, everyone, and see you soon. Bye.